The reason that I like to do healing in community is because I find that it's more powerful. And the reason I like to do retreats is because the depth of the work that we can do as a group of people healing that have something in common is truly remarkable.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today I sit down with Tamala Floyd, an internal family systems therapist whose work focuses on ancestral healing. Internal family systems, or IFS, begins with a simple but radical premise that we are not a single unified self. Instead, we are more a constellation of parts. Some parts protect, some parts are exiled, and some carry burdens that never belonged to us in the first place. Legacy burdens made up of beliefs and patterns inherited through our generational lines. If you're interested in IFS, I think you'll find that this is a really fascinating conversation with a deeply experienced and wise practitioner. Tamala and I talk about how her retreats function, how 30 people holding space can deepen one person's unburdening, and what healing looks like when the body knows it's being held with love. Here's my conversation with Tamala Floyd. Tamala, you are an internal family systems therapist, and I thought it might be a good way to start our discussion by explaining what that modality of therapy is for folks who are not familiar with it.
Yes, more and more people are becoming familiar with it, which is amazing. But internal family systems therapy is a modality which has made a big shift from looking at the mind as one whole and actually recognizing that our mind is multiple, meaning that we all have parts. So when I'm talking to clients, I'm speaking to them and helping them to get to know the various parts within what we call in IFS their system, which is your internal landscape.
Mm. Did you have a personal experience that led you to want to become an IFS therapist?
No, actually, what made me want to become an IFS therapist was reading about it. I read the book, The Body Keeps the Score. And in that book, he highlights IFS. And once I read it, it just made sense. And some of the things I was doing with my clients, although I did not at all have the IFS terminology, was very similar. And so it made sense to me for this to be a modality to get trained in and start using with my clients.
Okay. I had the founder of IFS therapy on the Voices of Esalen podcast about 7 years ago, Richard Schwartz, and we actually did work together, and that has turned out to be by far the most listened to episode that we've had. It's just a really popular modality.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
So you have refined this work in a certain way, and you focused on ancestral healing and intergenerational trauma. And so I'd be curious to hear you talk about what that looks like within the context of IFS therapy.
Yeah. So with IFS, we do healing around what we call legacy burdens. A legacy burden is a burden that we inherited from our generational lines. And so one of the things that I noticed that is in IFS, we bring the ancestors in order to heal the generational line. So one of the things that I wanted to do was bring the ancestors in a way where they are involved in the healing versus me just kind of bringing the ancestors and saying, okay, we're going to heal you also. I actually wanted the ancestors to be invited in to have an active role in the healing. And my thoughts around that absolutely comes from ancestral healing medicine. And what I was looking at is the fact that our ancestors know the history, right? They understand what has been carried on this generational line. So to bring them in to help with those legacy burdens that we've inherited, and we always invite a wise, well ancestor in. We want someone who has in the other realm released those burdens that they carried when they walked the earth. So that well ancestor comes in and helps with the unburdening or the healing process of that legacy burden, meaning that they help release it from the client, from other ancestors that also carried that burden, which also then releases that burden from our descendants.
That's really powerful. How do people typically discover the difference between they're carrying something that happened to them versus something they're carrying something that doesn't belong quite to them. It belongs to part of their ancestral lineage.
Right. So the big distinction is the personal burden. We gain those from our lived experience. So if something has happened to me in childhood, maybe I got bullied in school and then felt like I couldn't stand up, or I had to people please in order to keep myself safe from future bullying. That's my personal experience of that, right? But then I may have a burden where that all the women in my family are strong and they take care of the family. They're caregivers. And so I naturally fall into that role, although that was not a lived experience of becoming that caregiver. Often what people will say to me, my clients will say, I've always been this way. When someone tells me they've always had this fear, I've always had to be stronger, I always was the one to take care of, then I get curious if this is a legacy burden, something that was handed down. So then we're going to ask, who else in your family behaves this way, thinks this way? Oh, my mom does that too. I never knew my grandmother, but I hear stories and she was that way also. So now we have some confirmation that this is something that has been handed down to the family.
Do you find when you are working these retreats or working with people during session, do you find that it is illuminating for them to go back and understand like the history of their people, to have like hundreds of years of context, or is it more something that is within the realm of like my mother told me this, my grandmother told me this, and so on?
Most of it is they've been told or have had, some experience maybe with some of my clients, they knew their grandmother, great grandmother even. So they may have those stories that have been handed down or personal relationship.
Mm.
However, when they come into the actual connection with their ancestors, they learn more about their ancestry firsthand from those ancestors that show up in those healing, where we're healing those legacy burdens. Also, clients tend to continue to desire to have those relationships. So as they deepen in their relationship and knowing these ancestors, they learn more about the history. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which is really, really powerful.
Extraordinary, I would
Yeah.
imagine.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's this, if I'm not mistaken, there's this IFS process of witnessing where like a part can kind of show you the movie or some such of what hurt them. And when working with intergenerational trauma, what can that process of witnessing look like?
Right. Sometimes what we find when I'm doing witnessing, let me back up one step. So, witnessing would happen often when we're working with one of our exiled parts, like you said, one of our parts who have been wounded in some way, right? So, we want to know how that part was hurt, how it was wounded, and what it came to believe about itself because of that. But when we're looking at the ancestral piece, sometimes we get into that witnessing, and then the person or the part begins to witness something that wasn't actually their lived experience. And like they'll say, this is strange, Tamala, what I'm seeing, because I know this didn't happen to me, but I'm seeing it. So, they'll go on and start telling me, and then I'll ask, does this feel like this doesn't belong to you, that maybe this happened to someone else on your lineage? They said, no, it has to be because this didn't happen for me. And then as we explore that later, often we'll find out which ancestor, and sometimes not literally like which as far as a name, but it's an ancestor on my father's side or something like that. And so then we can look at unburdening that burden on the father's side where that legacy burden and that witnessing was coming from.
You're kind of expanding this container or this family that you have of parts of self that were
Absolutely.
previously off limits because of trauma.
Yeah.
If I understand
Yeah.
correctly.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you did this interview with the Good Life podcast, which I really liked, and you talked about parts kind of inhabiting or living in specific places in the body where I think they mentioned rejection. It might live in your heart and solar plexus.
Yeah.
Anxiety might live in your gut, for instance. So just wondering about ancestral trauma. Where could that live in the body? And
Oh my goodness. I really head to toe. I mean, I know that's a global answer, but it really depends on what it is. I've had clients talk about things that live in their head, in their throat. Oh, that's a big one, in their throat, especially talking about women losing their voices, not being able to stand up for themselves. Like you said, nervousness, anxiety, living in our gut, things that have lived in our back, like carrying the load of something that didn't belong to you, and literally having physical medical issues in the body, but it's related to parts, which, that was one of my personal experiences with parts in my body that literally caused me backache, stomachache, migraines. And you take the medicine, it might help for a little while, and then those migraines would come back, or those backaches, in my case, would come back. And later, what I found was, yes, I actually had a car accident earlier in life, was injured, received medical care, needed medication. But when I was pushing myself too hard, doing too much, taking on too much of a load, parts would use that injured back, exacerbate the pain, and cause me to have to be flat. It's like, okay, you've been doing too much. We're going to take you out altogether.
yeah,
So our parts can use pain that we really have that's diagnosed, but they also can cause pain. And so this is what we'll see when doctors say, we've looked at everything possible. We don't see a cause for this discomfort and pain. And they may refer a client to a therapist to look at what else may be going on. Parts are probably involved in that pain.
Mm. When people work with you, what is the trajectory of the healing? I'm wondering, is it the type of thing where people generally work with you for 1 to 2 sessions, or is it more sort of like within, like, let's say the psychoanalytic model, which would be much
Yeah.
longer and many more sessions?
Yeah. My clients tend to stick around, but let me tell you why. So, my area of expertise is childhood sexual abuse. So, we're talking deep trauma, and often my clients have been abused more than once. So, in that case, because of the extent and depth of the trauma, long standing, um, I typically see my clients for quite years.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Now,
Years.
I'm really interested that you brought that up and that happens to be your arena of specific interest, particularly because you've also sort of brought into the discussion this idea of ancestral roots. And I
Mhm.
think about something as childhood sexual abuse trauma as something that kind of iterates itself over and over from generation to
Yeah.
generation, unfortunately. So I'm wondering if you could speak about the way that those two things kind of like work hand in glove.
Yeah. So one of the things that I see with the childhood sexual abuse, and I'm just going to speak about mothers. A mother having been abused, and maybe her mother also being abused, what they then learn about, or what gets created in their inability to protect the next generation. So that's what I see being handed down, is that inability to protect their children after they have also experienced abuse, which then, of course, makes those children more likely to be in situations where they would be abused, because mom may not see it, may not pick up on the red flags, because again, that too can be handed down, that blindness
Mm.
in seeing that their children are at risk.
How do you help people feel safe as they begin to uncover? Like, I think that some of the techniques that people who have been abused sexually use are repression, keeping it away
Mhm.
from conscious understanding. So I'm wondering how you keep your clients feeling safe as they work to uncover some frightening
Yeah.
remembrances.
So this is what I love about IFS. I often say that you are only as good an IFS therapist based on you doing your own work. That we have to also work with our parts. So one of the reasons my clients feel safe is because I've done my own work. So I can show up in a self-led way ready to listen, not judging, offering compassion and care, and also letting them know that I believe that they will get better. And even though, because I have clients often who say, look, I don't know that this is ever going to change for me, that I'm always going to have these horrific nightmares or flashbacks or sexual dysfunctions, whatever it is that they're holding. I don't think this is ever going to get any better. And I can hold for them as we work together that I know it's going to get better. It's going to be slow. It's going to be slow go. I'm be honest with you, but it will get better. I say it to them with confidence because I am confident that it's going to get better. So that I can hold that for them. And that also makes them feel safe. The other thing I do to help my clients feel safe is I tell the truth. When I make a mistake, I own it. When there's some type of rupture, I come back to them and work on repairing it. I let them know that I'm human too, you know? So that also helps people to feel safe. Often I'll hear my clients tell me, you're the first therapist that fill in the blank. That listened to me, that gave me space, that didn't rush me, that didn't tell me it was in my head or whatever the ... is.
Yeah.
So those are the things that help people to trust and feel safe.
That's so beautiful. I had the thought, you must know other therapists who work within the realm of helping folks who have suffered sexual abuse. I'm wondering if there is something in particular about parts work or working within the context of IFS that is especially efficacious for this work.
Absolutely. When I found IFS, because I had been working in the field, say, over 15 years, 20 years before finding IFS. So this is the difference. And I think this is regardless of what diagnosis, trauma, history a person has. What I experienced before were models that will remain nameless, but I used them, but models that basically treated symptoms and taught us how to maybe manage a difficult relationship that we have with a parent, say, or a child. What I found with, and even if we talked about sexual abuse, ways to manage suicide ideation, ways to manage the flashbacks or the nightmares. Whereas with IFS, we're treating the root cause. So literally, when I became trained in IFS and felt ready and knowing the model well, I told all of my current clients that I want to transition you to IFS, and this is why. Up to this point, we've been treating symptoms, and now I'm ready to help you heal.
Is there a piece, like grief seems like it might be central for some of this, like grief for what was lost or what was inherited, what was denied. And I'm curious how you hold space for grief work within the context of what you're doing.
Yeah, it comes up no matter what I'm doing with my clients, that there are things that they lost along the way, having to grow up too fast. What I find though is that grief often is a number of parts within the system that may be holding grief and needing to express it. But the key in that work is, what did those parts come to believe as a result of whatever that loss is that they're grieving? So helping them around what was lost, the depth of the grief, and working with all of the parts that are holding it. Because sometimes, like, people will think the reason I wanted to explain it that way is because sometimes people who do this work will say, oh, that's the grief part. Whereas grief is actually held by many parts. So we need to work with all the parts in the system that are holding grief.
I'm thinking back on my own experience with IFS. After I had my interview with Richard Schwartz, I decided to get an IFS therapist, and I worked with him for about a year. And it just felt like it was I could have uncovered so many different parts, so many different exiles. And it felt like almost never ending. Like, I'm curious,
how it works, when do people kind of feel like I'm done?
Yeah, yeah. So that varies. It's interesting. I literally just terminated therapy with a woman who's been doing IFS therapy with me since I really started, really. So that means I've seen this woman for about 8 years. And yeah, so lots of parts have come up along the way,
Mhm.
but there also were lots of life transitions.
Mm.
So there may have been times where we could have pulled back, but then something happened, and then we continued with the therapy. How this particular client decided it was time is that she says, I know how to be with my parents.
Mm.
Like, like for the longest the reason, even though I would introduce, because I'm a therapist who will introduce termination, I think you're doing pretty good. I think we can start looking at terminating. And each time I would introduce it, she would say she wasn't ready. What she said to me that was clear was she said, I realized that you took some time off. I took a 6 month sabbatical. And she said, I had to manage and be with and support my parts in that 6 months. And we continued to see each other for maybe another 3 or 4 months. But she realized in that she was ready. So the key, I bring her up because what I'm looking for is how is the person able to engage their own parts? Can they be self-led? Do their parts trust them? Do their parts give space when they need to? The other thing about IFS, you're not doing the work until parts no longer get activated or triggered. That's an impossibility. That's not going to, there's going to be some type of activation, but, I still get activated around some of the work that I've done. But my parts trust me. I said, I hear you. Okay, let me manage this and then I'll come back and tend to you. In this moment, something happens that feels familiar to something that used to really, really trigger them. And now maybe they'll just get activated or come present. But that's a huge shift from them completely blending with me and taking over, and me having no realization that I'm actually in this part right now, right? So
Yes.
reaching out. So that's what we're looking for, is that the parts trust the client's self and that the client can now lead and be in relationship with those parts.
Mm. I want to hear a little bit about the role of community in some of the work that you do, because you lead retreats, and of course you lead retreats at Esalen Institute as well. But
Yeah.
what do the retreats look like? Who's drawn to take part in them?
It's it's a gamut of people. I mean, like I have people who've done, because most of my retreats are around intergenerational trauma and bringing the ancestor wisdom into that. So I get people who are very connected to ancestors to people who have absolutely no connection, maybe totally disconnected from one side of their family and have a curiosity about them and curious about, well, what do I need to know from the ancestors? Can I even connect with these ancestors that I know nothing about? I love when people ask me that question because the answer to that is the ancestors are waiting for you. We can say, I don't know them, but they know us. So the reason that I like to do healing in community is because I find that it's more powerful.
Mm.
And that we can, and the reason I like to do retreats is because the depth of the work that we can do as a group of people healing that have something in common, when we come together, we are creating not only a community in that moment, but many people then have community within that community. They become friends, or people pair up and change numbers and continue to do the work with one another. I also feel that when we get ourselves out of our usual environments, that's why I like doing this work on retreat. What that also creates, you're in a beautiful space there at Esalen with the sea on one side and the mountains on the other. It's just, and the ground that you're actually on, it just lends itself to healing.
Mm. I would imagine too that making connections, if someone is experiencing this work, making connections with other people would be so profound, because there is something about isolation. It feels like trauma and isolation go hand in hand.
They do. Trauma, isolation, and secrets.
Mm.
So that's another thing that people get to share when they start hearing others be vulnerable, and even if they're not vulnerable in the big circle, but just even being vulnerable and sharing something in a dyad, just with another human that maybe you haven't shared with anyone in your life, just how healing that can be, because that too is a form of witnessing, having another sit across from you and listen to your pain and be able to be there and hold you in that.
Yeah, 100%. Because I think a lot about the ways that early Esalen, when it came into being in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of the attraction was people getting together in circles and
Mhm.
engaging in some of like the new kinds of psychology, that humanistic psychology where people
Yes.
were speaking their truths in front of a group. And it was
Yeah.
so different than what came before. I see the work that you're doing is so in line with that power of stepping into that authentic self, denying the shame and the secrecy that comes with
Yes.
trauma, the power there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In my retreats, there's an exercise that I do with people where they share a secret with another without speaking it.
Mm.
And then I lead them through being held in sharing that secret. They just share it with their eyes and sharing that secret. And I ask the other person, just listen with love. Listen with love, hold what they've said. Nobody says anything. This is
Mm.
just that you've shared that, and then they change. Oh my goodness, the shifts that happens in people's system. So a secret can be shared that you never even spoke out loud, but someone held you in knowing you were sharing that secret with them.
I mean,
Yeah,
that
it's
yeah.
amazingly, Todd, it gives me chills every time I do that particular exercise. But when you're talking about secrets, and that's why I say, we don't have to say,
Mm.
and that's another beauty about the work with IFS. When, we talked about the witnessing, when a client is learning about the wounds, the pains, the abuses from their vulnerable, younger, vulnerable, maybe even exiled parts, they don't have to share it with the therapist. Like it's about the client coming into relationship with their younger self. And so the therapist holds that process and
Mm.
holds them in care and love while they're connecting. But we don't have to, I just need to check it. What what's happening right now? Are you
Mm.
understanding what this part of you is sharing with you? And so I can hold it without ever even knowing what those secrets were that part shared with the client. And that's another thing that makes IFS so powerful.
It is so powerful and so kind of exciting. It's a brave modality, I feel like. It's
It
it's not
is.
it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing I like about the fact that it's brave is that it also just helps you live life. I mean, like I'm living IFS, all the teachings of IFS every day in
Mm.
my life, not just well, I only do IFS when I'm in therapy. I'm only with my parts when I'm in therapy. No, I'm with my parts every day.
I would imagine when we're talking about ancestral healing and intergenerational trauma, I would imagine that cultural issues too, as opposed to just interpersonal issues, are part and
Right.
parcel about how that trauma gets formed.
Absolutely. And this is another piece of IFS is the whole piece of cultural legacy burdens. So we can have a burden that's personal or lived experience, legacy burden that's handed down through my generational lines, and then cultural, the burdens that because I grew up in the US, I'm faced with the cultural burdens of racism, patriarchy, homophobia. We can just go on and on and on. The burdens of this particular culture, but also there's burdens of other cultures too that we want to look at. And one of the things when you're sitting in a circle, we all didn't grow up in the US. So we get to hear about the cultural burdens of others and how that impacts them.
Mhm.
And the other thing I want to say is you can have one burden that's all three. There's my lived experience of that burden. There's my cultural, use racism, my lived experience of racism, my cultural experience growing up in the US of racism, and the legacy burden handed down my generational line of racism.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And when you're addressing issues such as these, do you find that it is easier to work one-on-one with a client, or that things run more smoothly when you can work in group and get the power of everyone's experience?
Wow, that's great. I think this is the way I'm going to say this, and I think this is why I do different work individually and in group.
Mhm.
The sexual abuse work, until someone has gotten to a certain place with that, well, first of all, my clients are going to want to do group work. You know, they really, it was hard enough a lot of the time for them to show up one on one because there's a lot of shame and blame, self blame with sexual abuse. So this may not be true for everyone, but because of the population I work with, I really feel that that is the work that we do individually. And I have led groups for women who have a sexual abuse history, but typically it's after doing some work with them individually. But then the generational healing work and ancestor work, absolutely. Anyone who wants to do this work, I refer them to one of my groups, whether it's a retreat or one of the self-discovery groups I lead, because I feel like we can get so much more work done on those topics in a group environment. Yeah.
And that's very interesting. And why is that?
The folks who feel disconnected from ancestors and being in a space where they're seeing other people connect with ancestor, or even the doubters. I have doubters coming. So, so they see what's happening. It's like, oh, well, maybe I too can have. So there's hope. There's an opening. So for folks who have come into this and not sure they can have those connections. The other thing about group is that I actually do healing demonstrations in the groups. I actually, will pick somebody to do a mini session of IFS with, or some of the other interventions we use in IFS. And so with everyone in the group present, healing is deeper. Like I can go much deeper with one person's system when I have 30 other people in the circle holding that high energy vibration for this healing experience than when it's just me and the client in my office. So that's another reason why I like doing the group work. It's just the synergy of the group work.
Oh, that sounds really powerful and just super
Yeah.
exciting.
And it is. It really is. I was like, man, I meet all 30 of you in my office.
Well, what about integration? Because I feel like from my understanding about IFS, there's a part of it that's unburdening, but then there's also integration when you're bringing those protector parts back in to see the exile is now accepted, it's stronger and more healthy and could potentially take on a new role. And when you're working to unburden ancestral trauma, what does the integration process look like?
Yeah. So one of the things that we do when we unburden the ancestral piece is, and we do this with personal too, but we bring in the gifts. But in this case, the gifts or the heirlooms that we're bringing into the system, into the ancestral line, are those that come from this ancestral line. So what I find when I do integration is that the clients really want to integrate and find ways to use those gifts that their ancestors gave them in their day-to-day life. Often those parts want to now say, well, one of the gifts that I received was ease. And so now I really want to see where in my life can I lean into more ease? Is it at work? Is it in the ways I interact with my children, with my friends? How do I bring? So that's what I find with the ancestral piece, is that it's those heirlooms that the ancestors actually invite us to embody. That the parts now, they want to run with them. Okay, we got some good things from our ancestors. Let's see how we can use this in our lives now.
Okay.
Yeah, and then hearing clients come back and report on that is really exciting to me, in the ways that they also truly experience the shifts within their systems, within their relationships, and really understanding that I really do have a true relationship with folks in my family line that I may have never even met before.
Mm.
Yeah.
What would you say changes in the folks who do this work with you? Not just internally, but in how they move through their world.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I'm going to use another IFS term, but I feel like they are more self-led. They're less activated. They're more patient with people. They're more connected. And these are the things that they share with me, like, the things that used to irk me, like, Tamala, I don't have any activation at all. It's like it doesn't bother me anymore. Like I can now think through more productive ways to handle situations that in the past they may have just thrown their hands up or raged or got angry about them. So it really is that they're able to show up more fully as themselves. And remember that the behaviors that they come to therapy with are burdens. These parts that are doing what they're doing, they're burdened. They were never intended to behave in these ways, but these ways made sense based on the wounds or abuses or, lack of attachment, whatever was going on when these parts took on these burdens. These were strategies in order to protect us. And now that they realize, hey, okay, Sam's in the driver's seat, Tamala's in the driver's seat, I don't need to do this anymore. Now our highest self can make decisions instead of our parts making the decisions for us and running our lives.
I love that. So for someone who's enjoyed this conversation, who kind of recognizes themselves in this conversation as having the potential to do this work, where would you advise they begin?
Well, they can contact me at tamalafloyd.com as one way. They also can go to the IFS website, which is ifs_institute.com. And you can find, if you're looking for a therapist, you can find a therapist in your area. For me, it would be more for group work, for retreats, things like that, not for therapy. But if you're looking for a therapist, you absolutely want to go to the IFS website.
And what retreats do you have coming up in 2026?
Well, in 2026, I have one coming up in May in Portugal that is for therapists who want to do their own work on intergenerational trauma and ancestor work. Because what I find is that therapists will have legacy burdens that impact their work with their clients. So that's what they'll be working on. Yeah. Then I have a retreat in August at Omega Institute. And of course, I'm coming back to Esalen in September. So those are the retreats I have coming up this year.
That's fantastic. Tamala Floyd, thank you so much for spending time with us today. You have made an impression on me in such a positive way. There's something about what you're saying that I feel really connected to. And I just want to thank you.
You're welcome, Sam. And I'm so glad. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. Our show is produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme song is by Nico Holloman. Additional music is the song Neville by Marfa. Until next time, be well.